we'll now move into our Q&A and continue with the lecture.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank Sherri and Darren again for all of that. And Valerie also, who introduced our panel, is joining us now. So I just wanted to give a few logistics. I know our time is short, and obviously there are so many wonderful things that have just been shared, and we're going to expand on that now. We probably won't have time for all the questions that we might get. So I just wanted to mention now that we are planning to create a free learning series to go much deeper into these themes. And so anybody, I'll put it in the chat for anybody that wants to be part of, knowing when that's going to happen. And I'm sure maybe we can post it as well on the website. But I think I just wanted to start. I know, Sherri, you and Darren each had a little bit more that you wanted to share as we think about sort of the practical next steps that people can take in how they're reframing and approaching some of these things. So Sherri, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you so much, Laura. I just want to say that I was watching the recording, and I would never so abruptly interrupt my friend and colleague Darren Ranco. That was a really abrupt edit, and it made me look like I jumped in the middle of his thought, and that's not how it happened in real life. I have a great deal of respect for Darren. So I think what would make most sense is for me to maybe handle the bigger, more philosophical perspectives of how do we move more into alignment with Indigenous scientific way of knowing, way of being, methodology, if you will. And then on the backside of that, Darren can get into some of the more, I don't want to say practical, but the more specific collaborative efforts that can be made in order to create greater partnerships. And so, when I think about this, and this essentially forms the basis of the follow-up to Sacred Instructions. It's the very beginning of this book is, the new book is to really look at the way that science has created a system where rationality is the only way of knowing. And so there is no way of knowing beyond rationality that has been allowed to even be contemplated within mainstream science. Sure, there's stuff on the fringes, but within mainstream science that really hasn't been contemplated. It hasn't been promoted. It hasn't been encouraged. In fact, the opposite has been true. There have been incidences throughout, the entire history of modern day science, going all the way back to the 1600s, where, we had Francis Bacon, who contemplated the impact of intention and wanted to figure out how to extrapolate a statistical analysis based on probability connected to intention. And then we had, going up through a number of others, including Einstein, who credits some of his work to inspiration that was given to him or answers that were given to him in dreams, right? But these things are not seen as being the norm. They're seen as being these random acts, right? This kind of almost supernatural event or occurrence that has happened. And that's the distinction between Western science and Indigenous science. Indigenous science has more than one way of knowing. Indigenous science often looks to dreams, visions, intuition, exploring hunches, not as a random or supernatural event, but actually as a tool to discovery. And so, and these things happen in very structured and controlled ways, often through ritual or ceremonial practice, where that information will actually be sought. And so this creates this whole other arm to scientific exploration for Indigenous science that doesn't exist within the mainstream and has oftentimes been completely excluded from even the consideration of possibility. And I think that a lot of that goes back to that whole rise of rationality, which was really rising up in opposition to the tyrannical reign of the Church of Rome. where you were dealing with the Inquisition, the witch hunts, and all of these other things that were rising up at that time that were really having a profound impact on the people. I look at what happened to Copernicus, right? And so when we think about expanding beyond rationality, when rationality rose up in kind of almost in defense of something greater than what was being offered through this really restrictive reign of the Church of Rome at the time. And then you think about science deniers that we have today, climate deniers, creationists, and others who have this very narrow view of their world based on religion. We can see where it gets to be tricky, right? Where there has been this demarcation point that has eliminated all multisensory forms of knowing and understanding that are often connected to Indigenous ways of knowing that have nothing to do with religiosity. And so we have teachings that are connected to what we call the three fires. And that's just an understanding and exploration of our three bodies: the physical body, the sensory body, the spiritual body, you know, and that correlates to intellect, emotion, and intuition. And so when we think about the three mind centers that have now been identified by mainstream science, we were talking about those same things using different language for hundreds of years. The stories that we have about the three fires and understanding that we have a mind center in our brain, we have a mind center in our heart, we have a mind center in our gut, and that those three mind centers have to work in coherence with one another in order for us to access the full measure of information that's available to us. And I think that that's where science really could begin to benefit from a more broad view, right? This is where the lens can be broadened. And I think it's challenging, right? So, you know, the only reason why we think about these things in terms of mysticism, or, you know, oftentimes they're referred to as the great mystery, is because science is not publicly acknowledged that these ways of knowing exist. They certainly have been government programs that have studied these things. We know that that's true, but they haven't been part of the mainstream. And so when we're thinking about, you know, what is this? What can we think about that's happened historically that can maybe help ease us a little bit into this? The thing that comes to mind for me is germ theory, and where the settlers to the New World started to. There's all these writings about how, you know, the heathen, that was us, the heathens, how they bathed every day in the waters. They submerged themselves in the waters every day, that we were looked at as being so odd because we actually cleaned our bodies on a regular basis, because this whole understanding of germ theory didn't exist. And because it didn't exist within that dominant culture, then it didn't exist. And I think it's the same kind of thing here, that, you know, that there are going to be incredible benefits, just like they were with the discovery of germ theory and cleanliness and hygiene. There are great things that can be learned from Indigenous peoples in regard to accessing multisensory information that might exist outside of the realms of rational ways of knowing. And so I think that that has to be the first step. You have to be able to even consider that as a possibility if you want to be able to move out of the strictures that have you so confined. And so I'm just going to offer that, because we could spend you know, a year breaking that down. I'm just going to offer that, and I'm going to turn it over to Darren to get into some of the, you know, nuts and bolts, collaboration, inclusion aspects of how we do that.
Thank you, Sherri.
Yeah, thanks, Sherri. Hopefully, well, let's see if I can. People can hear me. It seems like I'm on. I am the same person. I did get rid of my 2020 facial hair, so don't be alarmed. I'm the same person from the video. You know, again, you know, I'm excited that there will be this series, because, you know, just the small aspect of it. I made reference of MOU and memoranda of understanding that the institutional arrangements are very important in placing Indigenous science and peoples and human and non-human relations into institutional priorities is critical to this. And then I made the mistake by starting to answer some of your questions in the Q&A. It's not really a mistake, but there's just so much to share. So hopefully we'll get to that in the series if people are interested in. I would just say, like, you know, when people ask me the advice, because we've done a lot of work here at the University of Maine to make this work possible. And it's an ongoing struggle for all the reasons that we talked about and what Sherri sort of talked about in terms of the disconnects and the values that many of you are talking about in the Q&A side as well as the chat. And I mentioned that, you know, we've done some of this work in terms of research related to invasive species work and climate adaptation. We've drawn great inspiration from the Swinomish and other tribal groups who've done a lot of work around bringing together Indigenous science and values into climate adaptation planning. I'm working with actually Sherri's aunt to do a climate adaptation menu that's also inspired by the Anishinaabe, Menominee, and the Great Lakes region. So work that, you know, from the very beginning, and this is what I was referencing in my talk, you know, takes Indigenous scientific questions and priorities at their core. And I recognize that, you know, institutions and granting agencies don't provide enough resources and time to building collaborations and respectful commitments back and forth with Indigenous communities. You know, it tends to be the kind of thing where, you know, in order for me to get a grant from NSF or any other funder, I have to, you know, have a project already designed, right? But the whole part of what I'm saying is you shouldn't pre-design your work with Indigenous people. It should be done in collaboration. So thinking that process through, I think, is one of the avenues that we can all kind of institutionally work on to think about deeper, you know, different time scales for how research is done. So I'm just talking about research. There, talked about design, but you can think about all sorts of issues related to research that have to do with data collection and data management agreements. That's a very important thing. People who've worked at Swinomish have published on this. How do you do interpretation of data? How do you disseminate, share findings and data and collectively work on them? These are all elements of reframing the research process. And what I would suggest is getting people to work within their institutions to change values and raise consciousness on the one hand. And then I've seen questions here that people are talking about, like, how do I do this work without, you know, maybe I don't have Indigenous groups near me or any of that. I think, you know, this is part of the difficulty of having a one size fits all. I think there are these best practices out there. And I'm happy to share more of them. I'm starting to share them now. But I would say the research relationships being built up over time and really institutionalizing how that time is valued is a great challenge. And I think, you know, that starts at home, it starts locally. And I would say, you know, people ask me about the institutional work that we do for transformational institutional work. You know, always start in collaboration with small scale, really concrete projects that are, you know, we're not going from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds like a Tesla or something. We're really this is going to take some time, partly because of the histories of colonization and rejection of Indigenous knowledge as quote unquote real knowledge, as well as the role that academic and other research institutions have had in colonization and forced assimilation, et cetera. So I think, you know, really thinking that process through and really being committed to process work, which Sherri's done consultation work with a couple of global organizations around how do they make land-based relationships work with Indigenous people, and I think that's also getting a hold on those values and sort of how to do the process around the values is very important. In the pedagogical context, and I talked about this as well, it's even more difficult because institutions have all these sort of weird traditions around who gets to decide what is in the pedagogy. It's actually not, depending on what discipline you're in, and it's harder to kind of start from the beginning or from a project of what is in your forestry curriculum. Like those are decentralized in places that are accrediting agencies and all sorts of other professional contexts sort of shape how the pedagogies are done. I would say, and many of you who are participating in this conference are involved in forms of environmental and place-based education that we find very useful as a stepping stone to this work. So taking very seriously in terms of pedagogy and research that the place where this knowledge is found is not just in the university, but it's everyone, it's on the terrain of where Indigenous people are at, and that it's teachers and learners exist in both contexts, and really trying to make equal kinds of opportunities around what would otherwise be called place-based education, place-based environmental education, much like we've used sustainability science and the notion of sustainability science as to get us closer to these ideals around both pedagogy and research when it comes to centering, and I think, I say centering, including, it always feels too weak of a term in terms of what we're talking about here, but it's more transformational than that, and everyone starts in slightly different areas. So I guess I'll stop talking there, and really just, again, if I had, another hour or two, I could probably give you even better resources than just like articles that I had sent to my undergraduates for one of my courses in terms of answering your questions. But you all have really great questions, and I'm hopefully that this is the beginning and not the end of a discussion.
Thank you so much, Darren, for all of your work. Also, I think if people want to also write their questions both here in the chat, we'll try and capture it before we end, as well as in the form that we sent, you can put more questions there, and that can help inform the design of the series, because I think you're right, Darren, there's so much more to get into. Valerie, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And first, I just want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to hear what you've shared here, both today, Sherri and Darren, because it's such an important thing that as we move to become this global Council for Science and Environment, and we begin to look at this in different ways, this conversation today is just the beginning of what really needs to be this value shift that I have been talking about here. I've had opportunity for many years to work with local Indigenous folks here, and also with Robin Wall-Kimmerer here at SUNY ESF, and have learned that there is so much that we need to begin by saying what we don't know. And we need to really understand, and I do believe that there is a place for truth and reconciliation with respect to the hierarchical nature and elitist nature of science. And so there are things that we need to own, and we need to be aware of, and be willing to put our heart into science. We need to be willing to make these connections and to begin to understand that we're not just talking about making relationships with different people, we're talking about changing ourselves. And so I think this whole conversation about how we do what we do is really a shift. It's a shift of mind, it's a shift of heart, it's a shift of our intent, it's a connection, it's really truly coming from the point of view of connection to all things. I've had, as I mentioned, in terms of opportunity of working with others, one of the things that I had a chance to really launched me into this is I was asked to respond to an essay that was in the Human excuse me, that was an essay that was asking the question, what does Earth ask of us? And when that question was first posed to me, this was many years ago, and I thought to myself, wow, well, as a scientist, I'm not supposed to answer something like that because it's anthropomorphizing Earth. And I'm thinking, well, how could I answer that question? What does Earth ask of us? It seemed like a funny thing. And I stopped and I thought, no, I actually have an answer in here, but where is that coming from? Because all my science training was telling me that's not something you should be answering. So I'm hearing that in this one voice from this longstanding science training. And on the other side of me, or another part of me was saying, no, you actually do have an answer to that. There is a feeling inside. And so I did stop and I really looked at what was happening. And I thought to myself, well, okay, what is the answer to that question? And as fully human, not just science and trained by Western science, I answered the question of saying that we need to be citizens of Earth. And I'm an ecological economist and a social ecological system scientist. And so the answer also became that we're not just consumers, we're citizens. And that notion of ourselves as equal to everything else, human and non-human, is actually what Earth asks of us, from where that was coming from my most core place. And I think there's something akin to this process that we each need to find a way to address and be able to understand what is coming to us intuitively and be able to discern the importance of that and use that in conjunction with the intellect that we bring forward, that it's not just one or the other. This what I call the path of heart in science is really a truly important and very difficult thing to do when we've been trained to think so narrowly and so hierarchically. And there are many efforts out there to help us to expand ourselves individually. And I do believe that that's where we need to start. I believe that we need to start with this in our own individual selves and knowing we're going to stumble at times. We're going to make mistakes in our efforts to do this and try to understand each other, try to understand different ways of understanding the world, bringing together knowledge systems, beginning to have those conversations. And as we move that to the institutional level, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're learning and we're trying to learn together in ways of really making deep change. And so there is a lot before us to be able to figure out how do we do this? How do we do it well? But I think we need to go into it with humility and understanding that we will be making mistakes along the way, but always coming back, always learning from those mistakes, listening to one another, listening to Earth, listening to trees, listening to everything, that there's more there to answer us than we've been, as Western scientists, trained to understand. So I'll stop with that and just say that there's so much more to do with respect to the institutional, but as someone trained in Western science and in a position here with the GCSE, the Global Council, this is the exact work we need to be doing and doing together. And again, I'm really grateful to have this moment with you and to be able to learn from both all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Yeah, I'm so excited to work with everybody through GCSE and with Sherri and Darren and others on this series. And I think we're collecting all of your questions to really look at that as we think about this. I know we only have 4 minutes left here, so Sherri, I don't know if you've seen any of the chat or if you just have some closing words for us. And you're muted.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Valerie. One of the questions that stood out for me in the chat was someone saying that they were trying to get into an Indigenous community and they were told that it was going to take them 4 or 5 years to build a relationship. I think that is a real classic categorization between Indigenous science and Western science, where Indigenous ways of knowing come about as a result of long-term integrated relationship with their, surroundings. So whether it be the people, the place, the waters, the entire systems, whole systems. Western science is really oftentimes about what, in the grand scheme of things, looks like short-term observation and then prediction. And so I think what Darren was talking about, well, I know what Darren was talking about in regard to the two-eyed seeing is really about how do we marry those two ways of seeing into one holistic way of seeing that helps to inform that short-term predictive element of Western science and bring in the longer view of Indigenous knowing and being in relation to an integrated relationship with place, that there is a way for that to happen, and that there is a way for that to happen without it being the mining of Indigenous traditional or ecological knowledge, but as a mechanism of actually building relational networks with one another. And so I'm hopeful that this conversation and so many like it are just the beginning of those new relational networks being established over time. Somebody talked about RCNs, and I think that, that's something that we really need to start thinking about. How can we come together to address the immediate problems that we're facing in a way that actually sets a foundation that's solid enough to carry us into the future? And we're not going to do that by, counting on just add water theories, principles, or policies. We need to have something that's really substantial with deep roots into the ground in order for it to stand up tall. So.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, Sherri and Laura, and thank Valerie too for your words. Just real quickly, I'm an Indigenous researcher, and I still don't feel in fully, in partnership. I mean, I think it's true that in terms of the quote unquote dividends that get paid around these partnerships and how long it takes to establish them, but it's I get thanked all the time, and the transformational quality that the scientists, the Western trained scientists, non-native Western trained scientists that I've worked with, they, even after a short period of time, they'll come and thank me for including them by saying, like, this is the most transformational work I've ever done, just in terms of, and they have no publications, they have nothing. They are on a learning journey, right? So I think what Sherri was talking about is that if we all see ourselves as participating as learners and teachers all along, and not bear the brunt of being expert and the giver of knowledge and the receiver of data, that transformational work is difficult, or as easy as turning on the switch, but if you don't know where the switch is, it's like hard to know where. Anyway, I'm not very good at metaphors, but I will say that this is worthwhile action in the first minutes of you doing it, and I wouldn't measure it in terms of a 5 to 6 year. It looks different and feels different than other things that you may have done.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much. I know there's so much more. Even in our video conversation, we didn't get to include it all. You can go to the website, and we're included a bonus video because we couldn't quite fit it all in. So more really soon. And again, thank you so much to our panelists for being here with us, and to the GCSE team for all that you've done to put this on. So looking forward to more conversations in the synthesis sessions and beyond.